The 1920s was a dynamic era for women. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, and that created a monumental shift in American politics. During World War I, women were positioned in battlefields as nurses or communications operators. Back in the States, women took on jobs in agriculture and industry as tens of thousands of men were needed for the war effort. After the war, the necessity for additional labor in a growing economy allowed for women to become part of the workforce. Along with changes in technology, culture, and education, these new roles created a period of emancipation for women through greater independence and new opportunities. The women's suffrage movement started gaining strength as early as the 1840s as a way to gain women's rights. After years of organizational rivalries, a merger of different organizations formed in 1890 called the National American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, formed in 1873, which also pursued women's suffrage, gave a huge boost to the movement. Suffragists had made several attempts to gain the right to vote via the U.S. Supreme Court, but most of the efforts towards suffrage were on a state-by-state basis. The first state to grant women the right to vote was Wyoming in 1890, and the last, before the 19th Amendment, was Michigan in 1918. Finally, after decades of headway, setbacks, and turmoil, the 19th Amendment became part of the U.S. Constitution on August 18, 1920. It states, quote unquote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." This amendment opened the doors to freedoms for the women of the 1920s that their mothers could only imagine. The term flapper comes from a young bird flapping its wings, learning to fly, but in England in the 1890s, it meant high-spirited teenage girls. A couple of New York Times articles at the turn of the century wrote that the flapper was a young girl who wore their hair down their back and hadn't grown up enough to wear long dresses or their hair up. In 1912, another New York Times article wrote that the flapper is a young debutante. By this time, the term was used frequently in the theater for a young female character who was flirtatious, mischievous, and impetuous. By 1920, the Times described the flapper as, quote unquote, "the social butterfly type, the frivolous, scantily clad, jazzing flapper, irresponsible and undisciplined, to whom a dance, a new hat, or a man with a car were of more importance than the fate of nations." Hollywood used the term for a 1920 film, The Flapper, where a 16-year-old girl who sneaks away from boarding school to go to a party ends up being the stooge for a jewel heist through a series of amusing events. No one believes she is innocent of the crime due to her flapper behavior. Personally, I like the unsubstantiated story, though it was widespread thought, that the term flapper came into use in the early 1920s when a fad of unbuckled galoshes among coeds was popular. The galoshes flapped as the coeds walked. Early on, flappers were negatively thought of as pleasure-seeking, hard-drinking party girls. But as the decade rolled on, flapper fashion and attitudes crept into the lives of most women. They morphed into modern middle-class housewives who drove automobiles, chic shop owners and businesswomen, sharp-witted, glamorous film stars, and even matronly socialites who wore cloche hats and short skirts. The term dropped from favor with the onset of the Great Depression. The frivolous excesses of the 1920s seemed too distant within the dark cloud of the 1930s and almost nostalgically antiquated like a Charleston dance step. Automobiles became a suitable accessory for women that helped them in everyday errands, and improvements in automobile safety opened the market for female consumers. There was a modern freedom offered by the automobile, a carelessness and a connection to youth. General Motors promoted certain models as a wife's second car or as a leisure car for wealthy debutantes. The Jordan Car Company, in its famous Somewhere West of Laramie ads from 1923, targeted the consumer market of the young flapper that sold the sizzle of the jazz era. Without price or statistical information, the ad showed a woman in a racy automobile with poetic atmosphere and prose. The automobile in its freedom helped women's emancipation, and sales of cars soared from 7 million owners in 1920 to almost 120 million by 1929. While many older people wrung their hands at the possibility of canoodling in cars, etiquette maven Emily Post in 1922 declared driving as an unaccompanied woman perfectly appropriate. The car was a golden ticket from the home life and into the city life. The impact of World War I on society was profound and far-reaching. The 1920s was a social and cultural reaction to the war. It was a turning point in Western 20th century society. Previous to the Great War, traditional values and gender roles defined society, with the male roles dominating the political, financial, and labor realms, while the female gender was usually relegated to housewife status. When the men went off to war, women replaced them in the workforce. When the war was over, a lot of women were reluctant to go back to their pre-war lives, and this sparked the movement towards a greater equality. The war demanded men be violent and aggressive, traits that were previously discouraged in Western society. Men came back from the war disillusioned with traditional values and were open to ideas of societal change. The destruction caused by the war forced countries to rebuild, and it weakened established power structures. This created new economic opportunities, movements, and ideologies, challenging pre-war systems and thought. The post-war growth in manufacturing and trade, along with these new ideas, opened new doors for women and people of all backgrounds, contributing to the social and cultural changes of the 1920s and the direction of society beyond. Coinciding with new women's freedoms in the 1920s were Prohibition, jazz music, and Hollywood. Before Prohibition, women were not allowed near or in taverns. As soon as drinking became an illicit activity, it went underground. Both sexes intermingled in speakeasies where they could equally imbibe. Evading law enforcement seemed to create a new interest in drinking and partying, which broke down segregation and promoted drinking together. The irony was that many women advocated for prohibition, but after World War I and gaining the right to vote, many of those same women had a change of heart. Many underground establishments actually catered to their female patrons. Table service was offered to women who did not want to sit at a bar. Bootleggers and gangsters all welcomed money regardless of gender. Many women also ran their own speakeasies, ran stills, or peddled alcohol, making profits that rivaled men's yearly salaries in just a few weeks. Women stood out as owners, hostesses, and performers in the speakeasy scene. To catch these female perpetrators, new opportunities in law enforcement also opened up for women, as many states had laws preventing male agents from frisking female suspects. Jazz also had a profound effect on the new woman of the 1920s. While jazz music had started in the South a few decades earlier, after World War I, its audience steadily increased. Older generations considered the music immoral and threatening to cultural values. The phonograph and radio, along with the migration of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North, brought the popularity of jazz music into the home, dance halls, jazz clubs, speakeasies, and hotel rooftops. Women could escape traditional roles in a rigid society and were allowed greater freedom in their language, clothing, and behavior. The primitive and improvisational feel of the music echoed the rebellion and freedom of the era. While the foxtrot was still a popular dance, new dances such as the Charleston, Black Bottom, and Shimmy became part of the jazz music. Women's fashion changed with the dance steps. Freedom of movement was required. Women parked their girdles in the dressing room or didn't wear them at all. In 1920, hemlines were just above the ankle, but rose to just above the knee in 1926-27, just to come down again by 1930. A flat, drop-waisted, boyish look was in. Gone were the curves of earlier decades. Women taped or bound their breasts flat. Undergarments were squared off, and handkerchief, fringed, furred, or ruffled hemlines hung off their bodies. Through advertising, these dresses made it into everyday society. Working women and housewives wore short-skirted day dresses with cloche hats. Evening wear saw short cocktail dresses with ribboned or jeweled fascinators, many times with feathers. Designer Coco Chanel developed the ubiquitous, sophisticated little black dress in 1926, a profile women still wear today. Smoking became more popular among women as cigarettes were advertised as an appetite suppressant in a youth culture of keeping trim and maintaining their boyish silhouettes. Women's hair also had to adhere to this new music and its movements. Irene Castle, dance impresario, cut her hair short in 1915 as a matter of convenience. In the early 1920s, hair was long, but curled into tresses or gathered into a bun at the back. Still, this was different than a Gibson Girl transformation of 1910. Long hair had to be made flatter and flatter to fit within the tighter and tighter hats of the day. By 1924, most women were cutting their long tresses. Beauty shops couldn't keep up with the demand or absolutely refused to cut the hair of a woman in the new fashion. Women then descended on male barber shops who obliged to cut their locks. These new bobbed hairstyles were met with criticism by communities and older family members who believed long hair was feminine and a sign of godliness. But for most women, this new look was just another way of expressing new freedoms. There were many styles of bobbed hair in the 20s. Frizzy, wavy, and large was popular among white women in the early 20s, while flat and straightened was popular for black women. A straight center part, Dutch boy haircut was made popular by actresses Louise Brooks and Colleen Moore. By the late 20s, the flat shingle bob was popular as it had an elegant Art Deco flair at night, but could be easily covered by a tight-fitting cloche during the day. Hollywood also promoted the idea of the young, rebellious flapper who smoked, drank, and partied in short dresses and bobbed hair in their movies. The new woman took styling cues from actresses not only in dress and hair, but also in makeup. The lipstick tube was invented in 1915, but there was a stigma attached to makeup and harlots. By the 1920s, that stigma was gone, and most every pharmacy and department store had makeup counters where women found the latest powders, creams, lipsticks, and mascaras. Initially, powders made a woman look ghost-like, but then added rouge rounded and warmed the face. Eyeliner came about after the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922. Lipstick was applied in almost a purse shape, mimicking actress Clara Bow's bee-stung lips. Mascara was also applied to lashes. All these were supplied by now famous names such as Revlon, Coty, Max Factor, Rubinstein, and Arden, and displayed in tutorial beauty and makeup books. Handbags carried all a flapper needed to create an artificial Hollywood face with a youthful glow and a perfect pout. Her eyes were mysteriously darkened in the shadow of her brimmed cloche hat. While perfume was invented by the ancient Greeks, great perfumes were developed in the 1920s, such as Chanel No. 5, Arpège, and Shalimar. They were dabbed on by flappers and are still popular 100 years later. Lastly, Hollywood brought us the quote-unquote it girl. Unlike the Hollywood vamps of an earlier era, when sexual magnetism was portrayed as almost trance-like and rich men were reduced to nothingness by dark scheming beauties, the it girl had a strange magnetism that elicited physical attraction from both sexes, but mere beauty became unnecessary. Men could have it too. Actor Rudolph Valentino was probably the most famous male actor who possessed it. Eleanor Glyn, a British novelist of love stories, wrote a book called The Man and the Moment in 1914, where she used the term it to describe a characteristic that draws all others with a magnetic force. After the war, Eleanor went to Hollywood for the filming of one of her novels. She wrote screenplays for the famous Players Lasky production company, while also writing stories and articles for William Randolph Hearst various publications. Eleanor was also one of the earliest female directors and is credited with Gloria Swanson's rise from flapper starlet to elegant star. In 1927, Eleanor made a film from her screenplay It, featuring 22-year-old starlet Clara Bow, who Glyn felt possessed it qualities. Clara became Hollywood's it girl and lived up to her billings as the hottest jazz baby in films through the remainder of the 1920s. Author Frederick Lewis Allen stated that before the 1920s, quote-unquote, women were the guardians of morality. They were made of finer stuff than men and were to act accordingly. This thinking was rejected by most women in the 1920s. The fact so many men were lost during World War I meant fewer single men. Women didn't want to be politely noticed through a traditional courtship process. In throwing away their corsets, donning short skirts, wearing makeup, and dance movements in jazz clubs, the flappers seemed to vie for attention. They learned how to have fun in defiance of old societal rules. While women had some sexual experimentation before the Great War, the automobile took women to petting or necking parties where there is much sexual exploration just short of intercourse. Sex novels and sex manuals could be purchased, though birth control was not available. In fact, Lysol, the disinfectant, was mistakenly used as a spermicide and advertised for feminine hygiene. A sex researcher, Catherine Bement Davis, had long criticized the double standard condoning a man's sexual experimentation but condemning a woman's sexual experience. In her work, she became convinced that sexual ignorance posed the greatest danger to women's welfare. Her 1929 book, Factors in the Sex Life of 2,200 Women, was part of her mission to teach women about sex. It was a sampling of married and unmarried women, but skewed to white, educated, well-to-do individuals. Her study, though, is part of what historians call the first sexual revolution. The 1920s was a revolution in manners and morals, and sex was a large part of popular culture at the time. Not until the 1960s would a youthful American generation again question their parents' views of established sexual morality and expression. Though America sobered up during the Great Depression, the groundwork had been laid for the modern American woman in the 1920s through legislation, culture, media, and technology. By 1932, the first female senator had been elected, and Eleanor Roosevelt, a staunch feminist, became First Lady in the White House. Women continued to be a part of the workforce, albeit for lower wages than their male counterparts. They grew their skill sets at work and in the home. They would need all this experience, too, when we went to fight in yet another great war where women proved invaluable in the war effort. While there are those that want women to return to the traditional roles they once had today, there is no going back 100 years in Western society. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Also, here are 2 links to my 1929 Dodge video and my 1920 skyscraper video. Stay tuned for my future jazz video.